Sometimes the greatest miracle doesn't begin with a word. It begins with someone willing to sit in silence. Every servant inside Blackthorn Manor knew the same warning by heart. Never enter the Eastern Chamber unless summoned. Never attempt a conversation with the Queen Mother, and above all, never mistake her silence for kindness. For 36 years, the mother of Vampire King Sebastian Romano had spoken to no one. Physicians from Boston, specialists from London, renowned therapists from across America, and even respected vampire scholars had all failed to understand why the once graceful queen had chosen a life without words. Some whispered she had forgotten how to speak. Others believed an ancient curse had stolen her voice. The palace simply accepted the silence as another law that could never be questioned. Evelyn Foster had only worked at Blackthorn Manor for 12 days when the head housekeeper quietly handed her a silver tray and pointed toward the eastern hallway. "Take fresh tea to Her Majesty," she said without looking up from her ledger. The surrounding maids immediately lowered their eyes. One crossed herself without thinking. Another silently wished Evelyn good luck as though she were walking into a storm. Evelyn was 24 years old, with fair skin, gentle blue eyes, and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that kindness often survived where pride did not. She had grown up caring for an aging grandmother in rural Vermont before taking the long bus ride to New York, searching for steady work. She never imagined that the safest job she could find would place her inside the residence of America's oldest vampire royal family. The eastern corridor felt different from the rest of the mansion. The polished marble reflected pale winter light pouring through towering windows. Every footstep echoed as though the hallway itself preferred silence over conversation. Portraits of forgotten kings watched snow drifted gently beyond the glass. Evelyn balanced the tea tray carefully, reminding herself not to spill a single drop. She stopped before an enormous oak door left slightly open. Inside, an elderly woman sat beside a tall window overlooking frozen gardens dusted in white. Her silver hair rested neatly over one shoulder. Her posture remained elegant despite the passing decades. She neither turned nor acknowledged the soft knock at the door. The room carried no scent of illness, only cedarwood and fresh lilies placed on a nearby table every morning, although no one had ever seen the Queen Mother touch them. Evelyn stepped inside slowly. "Good afternoon, Your Majesty," she said gently as she placed the tray beside the window. No answer came. Only the faint crackling of the fireplace filled the room. She waited another moment before quietly preparing to leave. Then something caught her attention. The older woman's fingers rested lightly against the windowsill, tracing invisible circles through the thin layer of sunlight. It reminded Evelyn of her grandmother during long afternoons when words felt unnecessary because company alone was enough. Instead of retreating, she looked around and noticed a simple wooden chair resting against the far wall. Every instinct told her to leave. Every warning echoed inside her mind. Yet something about the loneliness surrounding the silent queen felt heavier than any rule written inside the palace. Without asking another question, Evelyn carried the empty chair across the room. She moved slowly enough not to startle anyone. Then she placed it several feet away from the Queen Mother, sat down quietly, folded her hands in her lap, and simply watched the snow fall beyond the glass. She said nothing, she asked nothing. Minutes slipped by. Outside, white flakes drifted over frozen rose bushes while distant bells marked another passing hour. Somewhere else inside the mansion, servants hurried through endless responsibilities, unaware that time itself seemed to slow inside the eastern chamber. What Evelyn didn't know was that hidden cameras monitored every royal hallway, and less than half a mile away, Vampire King Sebastian Romano had just paused in the middle of an important council meeting after security quietly informed him that a newly hired human maid had done something no one had dared attempt in over 3 decades. Back inside the silent room, the Queen Mother's hand stopped tracing circles against the light. For the first time in years, she slowly turned her head toward the young maid. Her pale eyes rested on Evelyn's face with calm curiosity instead of distant emptiness. Neither woman spoke. Neither needed to. Then, almost too gently to notice, the Queen Mother lifted one trembling hand and placed it softly over Evelyn's waiting fingers. At that exact moment, somewhere deep inside Blackthorn Manor, everything began to change. The warmth of another hand should not have mattered. Inside Blackthorn Manor, however, it changed the rhythm of an entire afternoon. Evelyn remained perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement might break whatever fragile moment had appeared between them. The Queen Mother did not squeeze her hand or offer a smile. She simply allowed the contact to remain, her pale eyes drifting back toward the snow outside the window. It lasted less than a minute before she slowly withdrew her fingers and rested them once again upon the polished wood beneath the glass. Evelyn quietly stood, collected the untouched teacup, and offered a respectful nod before leaving the chamber without expecting anything more. The heavy oak door closed with barely a whisper. Outside, the corridor felt strangely different. Two palace attendants stared at her with unmistakable surprise. Neither asked what had happened, neither dared enter the room themselves. By sunset, the story had traveled farther than Evelyn could have imagined. Kitchen workers spoke in hushed voices while arranging dinner trays. Gardeners paused their work to exchange uncertain glances. Even the security staff near the eastern wing seemed unusually alert whenever Evelyn walked past. She noticed the curious looks, but assumed they were simply reacting to another new employee making an awkward mistake. No one explained that the Queen Mother had not willingly touched another person in over 3 decades. The following morning, the head housekeeper placed another silver tray into Evelyn's hands. Her expression remained composed, although her voice softened almost imperceptibly. The eastern chamber again. Several servants looked up in disbelief. One older maid quietly whispered that the assignment should have been rotated. Another gently reminded the housekeeper that the Queen Mother usually dismissed unfamiliar faces after a single visit. The housekeeper answered with only one sentence. Her Majesty requested the same maid. Evelyn froze for a brief moment. Requested? She had not spoken a single word, yet there was no mistake. A handwritten note rested beneath the porcelain teapot, bearing only the royal seal and a single instruction authorizing Evelyn's entry. She carried the tray through the familiar marble hallway, noticing details she had missed the day before. Winter sunlight reflected across the floor like rippling water. A grandfather clock marked every passing minute with patient certainty. Somewhere beyond the gardens, crows gathered among leafless oak trees before disappearing into the pale sky. When she reached the chamber, the door already stood open. The Queen Mother sat in the same chair beside the window, wrapped in a deep blue shawl. Fresh lilies had replaced yesterday's bouquet. Their delicate fragrance filled the quiet room. Evelyn placed the tea beside her without speaking. This time she did not immediately reach for the empty chair. Instead, she waited respectfully, unsure whether yesterday had been a single unexpected exception. The older woman slowly lifted one graceful hand and pointed toward the chair across from her. No words, only a calm invitation. Evelyn smiled softly before sitting down once again. Minutes passed in comfortable silence. She watched snowflakes settle across the frozen rose garden, while tiny birds hopped between bare branches searching for shelter. Eventually she noticed a thick book resting unopened beside the Queen Mother's chair. The leather cover had faded with age, its edges softened by decades of careful use. A pressed lavender flower peeked between its pages. Evelyn looked toward the older woman with quiet curiosity. The Queen Mother gently pushed the book across the small table until it rested within Evelyn's reach. She did not open it herself. Evelyn hesitated before lifting the cover. Inside were hundreds of watercolor paintings instead of written pages. Winter forests, mountains, children flying bright kites. A family gathered around a fireplace. Every painting captured ordinary moments filled with remarkable tenderness. There was not a single word anywhere inside the book, only images. Evelyn slowly turned another page, then another. Across from her, the Queen Mother's expression remained peaceful, watching not the paintings but Evelyn herself. What Evelyn did not know was that less than half a mile away, King Sebastian Romano had cancelled the remainder of his afternoon meetings for the second day in a row. Standing before a private security monitor, he silently watched the live image of his mother, sharing something she had refused to show another soul for decades. And for the first time since inheriting the throne, the king realized that the impossible might not arrive through ancient magic or royal power. It might arrive through the quiet patience of a young human maid who never once demanded to be heard. The days settled into a quiet rhythm that no one inside Blackthorn Manor could explain. Every morning, just after the eastern windows caught the first pale light, Evelyn carried a silver tray through the silent corridor while the other servants watched her disappear behind the familiar oak door. No one asked what happened inside. They only noticed that the Queen Mother never refused her company. It became an unspoken ritual. Evelyn would prepare fresh tea, straighten the vase of lilies, and sit in the same wooden chair beside the window. Some mornings they watched snowdrift across the frozen gardens. Other afternoons they watched rain paint soft lines across the glass. Words never filled the room, yet the silence no longer felt lonely, it felt shared. On the fifth morning, Evelyn arrived carrying a small music box she had discovered while organizing forgotten storage shelves below the west staircase. The brass edges had tarnished with age, but when she gently wound the tiny key, a delicate melody floated into the quiet room. It was slow, graceful, almost like a lullaby remembered from another lifetime. She placed the music box on the table without expecting any reaction. At first, nothing changed. Then she noticed the Queen Mother's fingertips freeze above the windowsill. Her breathing became slightly deeper. Her eyes slowly closed as though listening to something far beyond the tiny instrument. Evelyn quietly allowed the melody to finish before closing the lid. Neither woman moved for several seconds. Then, for the first time since these visits had begun, the Queen Mother reached toward the music box herself. Her elegant fingers rested gently upon its weathered surface before tracing the carved rose engraved into the lid. A single tear shimmered beneath her lashes, but it never fell. Evelyn instinctively reached for a folded linen handkerchief and placed it beside her without making the older woman feel observed. The Queen Mother glanced toward the handkerchief, then toward Evelyn. Her expression softened with unmistakable gratitude. She did not need words to say thank you. Across the mansion, whispers continued to spread. Guards assigned to the eastern wing quietly reported that fresh flowers now appeared inside the Queen Mother's chamber every afternoon instead of every 3 days. Kitchen staff noticed that untouched meals had become half empty instead of completely untouched. Even the royal physician admitted her pulse had become steadier during his weekly examination, although she still refused every spoken question with the same calm silence. Nobody understood why these small changes had begun only after the arrival of a young maid from Vermont. That afternoon, Evelyn volunteered to help trim the winter roses beneath the eastern windows. Most of the bushes had already surrendered to the season, their branches bare beneath fresh snow, yet one stubborn white bloom still clung to a thin stem despite the freezing wind. Smiling to herself, she carefully protected it with a small wooden garden cover before returning inside. She never noticed the Queen Mother watching from the tall window above. Less than an hour later, King Sebastian Romano entered the eastern hallway without his royal escort. He rarely visited during Evelyn's scheduled hour, choosing instead to respect the fragile routine from a distance. Today, however, curiosity outweighed caution. He stopped outside the partially opened door. Through the narrow opening, he saw his mother standing, not sitting, standing beside the window with one graceful hand resting against the glass, his breath caught. She had not willingly risen during one of her quiet afternoons in years. He followed her gaze. Below, Evelyn knelt in the snow, carefully brushing ice away from the single surviving white rose so it would not break beneath the weight of winter. The young maid smiled as though protecting one flower mattered just as much as protecting an entire garden. Sebastian said nothing. He simply watched the reflection of that gentle scene appear in his mother's eyes. What Evelyn did not know was that the king had just witnessed something even more extraordinary than the standing itself. As the music from the tiny box echoed faintly in his memory, he recognized the forgotten melody immediately. It had been composed by his late father and performed only once every winter inside the palace decades before the silence began. No servant should have known it existed, yet somehow, without asking a single question, Evelyn had placed the one melody capable of reaching a heart that the entire kingdom believed had been closed forever. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the gardens surrounding Blackthorn Manor, but inside the eastern wing time still seemed to move according to a quieter rhythm. Every afternoon, after completing her household duties, Evelyn carried fresh tea, new lilies, and whatever small piece of ordinary life she happened to find that day into the Queen Mother's chamber. Sometimes it was a smooth stone collected from the frozen garden path. Sometimes it was a feather left behind by a snowy owl resting near the fountain. Once it was nothing more than the scent of freshly baked bread that lingered on her apron after helping in the kitchens. The Queen Mother accepted each quiet offering with the same gentle attention, never speaking, yet never turning away. The servants had stopped treating Evelyn's visits as an accident. They had become part of the palace routine, although no one understood why. Some believed the young maid possessed unusual empathy. Others quietly suggested that perhaps loneliness recognized loneliness. Evelyn ignored every rumor. She had stopped trying to understand why the older woman's company felt so natural. She simply continued showing up every day. One grey afternoon, heavy clouds covered the sky, leaving the entire manor wrapped in soft silver light. The Queen Mother stood beside one of the tall bookshelves instead of sitting by the window. She slowly ran her fingertips across rows of worn leather bindings before pausing at a single narrow volume tucked between much larger books. Her hand rested there for several seconds before she stepped away, leaving the book exactly where it was. Evelyn noticed the unusual gesture but waited until the older woman returned to her chair before approaching the shelf. Carefully removing the slim volume, she discovered it was not a diary or a novel. It was a catalogue of paintings once displayed throughout the royal residence decades earlier. Most pages showed elegant portraits, landscapes, and formal ceremonies. Then one page immediately caught her attention. A watercolor painting showed the Queen Mother many years younger, smiling beside a handsome king, while a little boy, no older than 8, held both of their hands in a blooming spring garden. The young prince could only have been Sebastian. What surprised Evelyn was not the painting itself, it was the handwritten note beneath it. The ink had faded with time, but several words remained perfectly readable. The annual Spring Melody Festival. Her Majesty personally selected the closing song. Evelyn quietly looked toward the music box resting on the nearby table. The melody she had played days earlier suddenly felt connected to something much larger than coincidence. Before she could study the page further, she noticed that the final section of the catalogue had been cleanly removed. Several pages had been carefully cut away years before. Whoever had done it had taken their time. There were no torn edges, only empty space where an important chapter should have remained. Evelyn gently closed the book and returned it exactly where she had found it. Across the room, the Queen Mother watched every movement with calm, attentive eyes. She had seen Evelyn discover the missing pages. She had also seen that the young maid respected the silence enough not to ask questions. That quiet restraint seemed to matter far more than curiosity. Later that evening, after finishing her duties, Evelyn walked through the nearly empty palace library searching for books about the history of Blackthorn Manor. The enormous room smelled of cedar shelves and aging paper. Rain tapped softly against stained glass windows while golden lamps cast warm pools of light across polished wooden tables. She eventually located several historical volumes describing royal ceremonies, family traditions, and architectural renovations, but none mentioned the missing paintings or the Spring Melody Festival after the year shown inside the catalogue. It was as though an entire memory had quietly disappeared from official history. What Evelyn did not know was that less than half a mile away, Sebastian Romano stood inside the restricted royal archive, holding an identical catalogue in his hands. His copy also ended with the same carefully removed pages. For years he had believed they had been damaged by age, never questioning why only those specific records had vanished. Now, after watching Evelyn unknowingly uncover the same mystery within his mother's chamber, a question settled heavily into his mind. If someone had deliberately erased part of the royal family's happiest memories, perhaps the silence that followed had never been caused by illness at all. Perhaps the truth had simply been hidden so completely that even the king himself had never been allowed to find it. Morning sunlight spilled across the marble floors of Blackthorn Manor, replacing the cold silver tones of winter with a softer golden glow. The entire estate seemed to breathe differently as spring slowly approached. Fresh blossoms appeared along the eastern gardens, and for the first time in years, the servants noticed that the curtains inside the Queen Mother's chamber remained open long after sunrise. No one commented on the change aloud, but everyone noticed it. Evelyn continued her quiet routine exactly as before. She carried tea, arranged fresh lilies, opened the windows whenever the weather allowed, and spent each afternoon beside the older woman without demanding conversation. The silence between them had become something gentle instead of empty. It was a place where neither of them needed to pretend. One afternoon, while replacing faded flowers with newly gathered white lilies from the greenhouse, Evelyn noticed a faint breeze drifting through the open window. A single petal landed on the Queen Mother's lap. Before Evelyn could retrieve it, the older woman carefully picked up the petal herself and turned it over between her fingers, studying its delicate shape as though remembering something long forgotten. Then, without hesitation, she reached toward the vase beside her chair and quietly rearranged every flower until they faced the sunlight instead of the room. Evelyn smiled. It was such a simple gesture, yet it felt important. The Queen Mother was no longer merely existing inside the chamber. She was choosing how it looked, choosing what she wished to see. Across the mansion, word of these quiet changes eventually reached the royal council. Some advisors insisted they were meaningless coincidences. Others believed the human maid had somehow disrupted routines that had remained unchanged for decades. Sebastian Romano listened to every opinion without revealing his own. Instead of issuing new orders, he quietly instructed the household to allow Evelyn complete freedom to continue her visits. He did not explain why. That evening, while returning several history books to the palace library, Evelyn discovered an elderly archivist struggling to lift a heavy wooden storage box onto a high shelf. She immediately stepped forward to help. Together they carefully lowered the box onto a nearby table instead. The old man thanked her warmly before noticing the catalogue she had borrowed the previous evening. His expression changed almost instantly. He gently closed the cover with surprising urgency. "Some memories are protected for a reason," he said quietly. "Not because they are dangerous, but because they are painful." Before Evelyn could ask what he meant, another librarian called the archivist away, leaving the mysterious sentence hanging in the silent room. She did not chase after him. Instead, she returned the catalogue exactly where it belonged, respecting boundaries she still did not understand. The following afternoon, an unexpected invitation arrived. Rather than serving tea inside the eastern chamber, Evelyn was instructed to accompany the Queen Mother into the royal conservatory overlooking the gardens. Several attendants stood frozen in disbelief as the older woman slowly walked through the hallway with measured grace, supported by no one. Sunlight poured through towering glass walls filled with blooming orchids, climbing ivy, and fragrant jasmine vines. Birds fluttered freely beneath the enormous glass ceiling, while a small fountain filled the air with the quiet sound of flowing water. Evelyn remained a respectful step behind until the Queen Mother paused beside an old stone bench surrounded by flowering roses. She gently rested one hand against the weathered surface before looking toward Evelyn. There was no hesitation this time. With calm certainty, she reached out and lightly took the young maid's hand before guiding her to sit beside her beneath the warm afternoon light. Several attendants watching from the entrance exchanged stunned glances. None of them had witnessed the Queen Mother initiate physical contact in public since long before Sebastian became king. From an upper balcony hidden behind climbing ivy, Sebastian observed the scene without interrupting it. He saw no miracle, no ancient magic, no dramatic revelation. Only his mother choosing one quiet step at a time to let another human remain close. Yet what caught his attention most was not the gesture itself, it was the expression on her face. For years she had looked at the from it by invisible glass. Today, for only a fleeting moment, she looked present, hopeful, alive. What Evelyn did not know was that one member of the Royal Council had also witnessed everything from the opposite corridor. Quietly slipping away before anyone noticed, the advisor headed toward the restricted archives carrying a single purpose. He intended to recover whatever records had disappeared decades earlier before the young maid unknowingly uncovered a truth the palace had spent an entire generation trying to bury. The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain, leaving every stone path around Blackthorn Manor glistening beneath pale spring sunlight. The gardens smelled of damp earth and blooming lilies, and for the first time in weeks, the eastern fountain flowed again after remaining silent throughout the winter. Evelyn carried her familiar silver tray through the manor with the same quiet pace she always kept, unaware that nearly every member of the household now watched her pass with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. What had begun as an ordinary assignment had quietly become part of the rhythm of the palace itself. When she entered the Queen Mother's chamber, she immediately sensed something different. The room felt brighter. The windows stood fully open, allowing fresh morning air to drift through the lace curtains. A small songbird had landed on the stone railing outside, singing softly toward the room before disappearing into the flowering trees. The Queen Mother was already awake, seated beside the open window with a folded blanket resting neatly across her lap. Evelyn placed the tea beside her as usual, then quietly refreshed the vase with fresh white lilies gathered only an hour earlier. As she adjusted the flowers, her eyes drifted toward the bookshelf where she had previously discovered the catalogue with the missing pages. Something immediately caught her attention. The narrow volume no longer rested between the larger books. Assuming another servant had returned it to the royal library, she thought little of it until she noticed a faint rectangle of dust left behind where the book had stood for decades. Someone had removed it recently. The Queen Mother followed Evelyn's gaze toward the empty space before lowering her eyes. For the first time since their friendship had begun, a trace of sadness crossed her otherwise peaceful expression. Evelyn did not ask about the missing book. Instead, she slowly wheeled a small tea table closer to the window so the older woman could enjoy the morning sunlight while drinking. The Queen Mother watched every thoughtful movement before reaching toward a folded linen napkin. With remarkable precision, she picked up a silver teaspoon and gently tapped it twice against the porcelain teacup. The clear ringing sound echoed softly through the quiet room. Evelyn looked up, surprised. The older woman repeated the same 2 gentle taps before pointing toward the empty chair beside her. Evelyn smiled and took her seat. It was not speech, but it was unmistakably communication. They shared tea while birds continued singing outside, and for nearly an hour neither of them felt the need to disturb the peaceful silence surrounding them. Elsewhere inside the manor, Sebastian Romano met privately with the elderly archivist who had served the royal family since before his birth. Together they examined inventory records stretching back almost 40 years. Every official document claimed the same thing. The missing catalogue pages had supposedly been destroyed during a minor water leak decades earlier. Yet the archivist quietly admitted that the explanation had never completely satisfied him. Paper damaged by water, curls and stains, the old man said while carefully adjusting his spectacles. Those pages were removed with a blade. Someone wanted them gone. Sebastian remained silent for several moments, studying the careful handwriting preserved throughout the surviving records. If someone had deliberately erased part of his family's history, then everything he believed about his mother's silence suddenly felt uncertain. By late afternoon, Evelyn volunteered to help organize several forgotten cabinets inside the palace music room. Dust covered nearly every instrument stored there, including antique violins, polished cellos, and an elegant grand piano that had not been played in years. As she gently wiped the piano lid clean, she noticed a faded sheet of music tucked beneath the bench. Across the top, written in graceful handwriting, were the words, "Spring Melody Festival Finale." Her heart skipped. It was the same title she had seen beneath the painting inside the missing catalogue. Before she could read another line, the palace librarian hurried into the room with visible concern. He politely but firmly collected the music and apologized, explaining that several historical items had been mistakenly left unsecured during inventory. Evelyn nodded without protest and watched him leave. She still believed she had simply stumbled upon forgotten family keepsakes. What she did not know was that the librarian carried the music directly to Sebastian, where the king compared it with every surviving royal archive before quietly reaching a realization that unsettled him more than any ancient legend ever had. The official history insisted that the Spring Melody Festival ended because the Queen Mother lost her voice to grief. But every missing record, every carefully removed page, and every hidden piece of music suggested a very different possibility. Perhaps the kingdom had spent 36 years believing the wrong story. Rain fell softly across Blackthorn Manor that evening, turning every garden path into a mirror reflecting the warm lights glowing behind the palace windows. The steady rhythm of water against the glass made the eastern chamber feel even quieter than usual. Evelyn arrived carrying fresh tea, but before she could set the tray upon the table, she noticed something unexpected. The Queen Mother was not sitting beside the window. She stood before an old wooden cabinet tucked into the corner of the room, one hand resting lightly against its carved door. When Evelyn entered, the older woman slowly stepped aside and looked toward the cabinet before meeting her eyes. It was the clearest invitation she had ever offered. Evelyn approached carefully and opened the cabinet. Inside rested only one object, a small velvet box covered in a thin layer of dust. She glanced toward the Queen Mother, silently asking permission. The older woman gave the smallest nod. Inside the box lay a silver pocket watch, its surface engraved with delicate vines surrounding the royal crest. The watch had stopped long ago, its hands forever pointing to exactly 4:17. Beneath it rested a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Unlike every journal or album Evelyn had previously discovered, this page contained only one sentence written in elegant "Was my choice." Evelyn quietly read the sentence again. There was no signature, yet somehow she knew those words belonged to the Queen Mother. She carefully returned the paper to its place before looking toward the older woman. The Queen Mother slowly reached for the pocket watch and held it against her heart for several long seconds. Then she closed her eyes. What Evelyn did not know was that less than half a mile away, Sebastian Romano sat alone inside the restricted archive, comparing newly recovered records with forgotten council reports that had never been shown to the public. One sealed document finally revealed the truth hidden beneath decades of carefully repeated assumptions. The Queen Mother had never lost her voice. Royal physicians had confirmed that within days of the former king's passing, she had simply refused to speak again. The official explanation given to the kingdom had been written afterward to protect both the royal family and the nation from endless speculation. Sebastian lowered the report slowly, unable to look away from the final paragraph. It described the last private conversation between his parents on the evening before his father died peacefully from a sudden illness that no physician had recognized in time. According to the report, the Queen Mother had persuaded the king to attend the closing ceremony of the Spring Melody Festival despite his exhaustion, because the people had gathered from across the country hoping to hear his favorite composition one final time. He insisted he felt well enough to go, smiled through the ceremony, returned home, and quietly passed away before sunrise. No accusation had ever been made against the Queen Mother. No one had blamed her, yet after that night she blamed herself. She convinced herself that if she had asked him to rest instead of encouraging him to honor the tradition, he might have lived a little longer. From that moment forward, she chose silence because she believed her words had carried him toward his final night. Sebastian closed the archive and stared into the darkness beyond the library windows. For 36 years he had accepted the comforting story that fate had stolen his mother's voice. The truth was infinitely sadder. She had surrendered it herself. Back inside the Eastern Chamber, Evelyn remained beside the Queen Mother without mentioning the note or the watch. Instead, she quietly poured fresh tea into 2 porcelain cups before placing one within easy reach of the older woman. The Queen Mother watched the rising steam before lifting her eyes toward Evelyn. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she placed the silver watch into the young maid's hands. It was the first personal belonging she had willingly shared with anyone since the former king's passing. Evelyn accepted it with both hands, treating it not as a priceless royal treasure, but as the memory of someone deeply loved. Tears shimmered gently in the Queen Mother's eyes. Her lips parted ever so slightly as though a lifetime of silence had reached its breaking point. No sound emerged, not yet, but for the first time in 36 years, the silence itself no longer felt permanent. Morning arrived wrapped in gentle fog, leaving Blackthorn Manor surrounded by soft white mist that blurred the line between the palace and the awakening gardens beyond. Dew shimmered across every flower, and the eastern windows glowed with quiet golden light as the sun slowly climbed above the trees. Evelyn carried the silver pocket watch carefully inside her apron pocket throughout the morning, not because she feared losing it, but because she understood it had become far more than an old family heirloom. It was trust. Before noon she returned it exactly as she had received it, placing the velvet box gently upon the small cabinet inside the Queen Mother's chamber. The older woman watched every careful movement before offering the smallest nod of gratitude. Neither woman reached for the watch again, neither needed to. The memory it carried had already been shared. Instead of preparing tea immediately, Evelyn noticed the familiar music box resting upon the nearby table. She wound the tiny key only once before allowing the delicate melody to fill the room. Unlike the first time she had played it, the Queen Mother no longer reacted with surprise. Her eyes slowly closed, and a peaceful expression softened every line upon her face. The melody drifted through the open windows, mixing with bird song and the gentle sound of water flowing from the garden fountain below. Evelyn quietly sat beside her without interrupting the moment. Minutes passed. The final notes slowly faded into silence. The Queen Mother opened her eyes and looked toward the young maid with unusual determination. She reached toward the music box, closed the lid herself, and rested both hands upon it. Then she drew one slow breath after another. Evelyn remained completely still. She sensed that something fragile was unfolding and understood instinctively that even kindness could become pressure if offered too quickly. She simply waited. Outside the chamber, footsteps approached before stopping at the doorway. Sebastian Romano stood just beyond the partially open door, having arrived only to check on his mother's morning routine. He intended to leave without disturbing them. Yet something in the stillness of the room persuaded him to remain hidden in the hallway. What he saw next rooted him in place. The Queen Mother lifted her gaze toward Evelyn. Her lips trembled ever so slightly. Decades of silence seemed to gather inside a single breath. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost carried away by the breeze, she spoke, "Thank you." The single phrase barely rose above a whisper, but it echoed through the quiet chamber with greater force than any royal proclamation. Evelyn's eyes widened, not because she had expected applause or celebration, but because the sound carried no fear. She smiled gently, careful not to react too dramatically, as though protecting the delicate courage that had made those 2 simple words possible. "You do not have to thank me, Your Majesty," Evelyn answered quietly. I only wanted you to know that you never had to sit alone." The Queen Mother's eyes filled with tears that finally slipped down her cheeks. She did not hide them. She slowly reached across the small table and placed her hand over Evelyn's once again. This time there was no hesitation. Her breathing steadied, as though an invisible weight had begun lifting from her shoulders one careful moment at a time. Outside the doorway, Sebastian lowered his head. He had imagined this moment thousands of times throughout his life. Physicians had promised miracles, scholars had offered ancient explanations, advisors had insisted more time was needed. Yet the first words his mother chose to speak after 36 years had not been spoken to a king, a doctor, or a council. They had been spoken to a young human maid who had never asked her to explain the silence. What Evelyn did not know was that every guard assigned to the eastern corridor had quietly heard the whisper through the open doorway. Within minutes, the impossible news began traveling across Blackthorn Manor. Servants stopped in the middle of their work. Gardeners looked toward the eastern windows. Even the oldest members of the household stood speechless. But inside the chamber, none of that mattered. For the first time in more than 3 decades, silence was no longer the strongest voice in the room. Hope was. The whisper spoken that morning lingered inside Blackthorn Manor long after the sound itself had faded. No one celebrated loudly. No bells rang across the estate. Instead, an unusual calm settled over every hallway, as though the entire palace understood that some miracles deserved silence more than applause. Evelyn continued her duties exactly as before, refusing every curious question from the servants with the same gentle smile. She did not believe the Queen Mother's courage belonged to gossip, it belonged to trust. By late afternoon, another invitation arrived from the Eastern Chamber, but this time the message carried the royal seal of the king himself. Evelyn was instructed to accompany the Queen Mother to the small family sitting room overlooking the southern gardens, a room that had remained closed since the former king's passing decades earlier. The housekeeper personally unlocked the carved walnut doors, revealing a warm room filled with afternoon sunlight, faded family photographs, shelves lined with well-read books, and a stone fireplace that still carried the faint scent of cedar from winters long ago. Dust no longer covered the furniture. Someone had quietly prepared the room earlier that day. Evelyn gently guided the Queen Mother inside before stepping back to give her space. The older woman slowly walked around the room, allowing her fingertips to brush across familiar objects she had not touched in years. She paused before a framed photograph showing a young Sebastian standing between his parents beneath blooming cherry trees. The smile on the former king's face seemed almost alive beneath the glass. The Queen Mother rested one hand lightly against the frame before closing her eyes. A quiet knock echoed through the room. Sebastian entered alone, without guards, advisors, or royal attendants. For a long moment, none of the three spoke. The king remained near the doorway, almost uncertain whether he belonged inside the memory preserved within those walls. Evelyn quietly stepped toward the window, giving mother and son the privacy of distance without leaving the room entirely. Sebastian slowly approached until he stood only a few feet from his mother. He had addressed nations without hesitation. He had negotiated peace between rival vampire houses. Yet now, standing before the woman who had raised him, he searched for words that refused to come. The Queen Mother looked at him with quiet tenderness. Her lips parted once more, this time with greater confidence than before. "Sebastian," she said softly. Hearing his own name spoken in her voice after 36 years brought tears instantly to his eyes. He lowered himself onto one knee beside her chair, not as a king before a queen, but as a son who had waited nearly an entire lifetime to hear his mother call him again. She gently placed one hand against his cheek, exactly as she had when he was a frightened little boy. "I am sorry," she whispered. Sebastian immediately shook his head. "No, Mother," he answered, his voice steady despite the emotion filling the room. "You have carried enough sorrow for all of us." She looked at him with quiet surprise, as though she had expected blame instead of compassion. Evelyn watched from the window, realizing that the silence separating this family had never truly been built by missing words. It had been built by years of unspoken forgiveness, waiting for someone brave enough to offer it first. The Queen Mother's eyes drifted toward the photograph once again. "Your father loved that festival," she said gently. "He chose to go because it brought him joy. I only forgot that for far too long." Sebastian carefully took both of her hands into his own. "Then let us remember what he chose," he replied, "instead of what you feared." The afternoon sun slipped lower across the gardens, filling the room with warm amber light that danced across the old photographs and polished wooden floors. What Evelyn did not know was that several members of the royal council stood quietly beyond the closed doors, having expected to witness another painful silence. Instead, they heard peaceful conversation flowing from the room that had remained empty for decades. At that exact moment, the story of the royal family changed forever, not because an ancient mystery had finally been solved, but because a mother had forgiven herself, a son had finally understood her heart, and a quiet human maid had shown them both that healing sometimes begins with nothing more extraordinary than staying beside someone long enough for hope to find its voice. The morning after their long-awaited conversation, Blackthorn Manor awakened with a sense of quiet purpose that no one could fully explain. The servants still walked the polished corridors with the same discipline. The royal guards still stood watch beneath towering stone archways, and the garden still welcomed the first warm days of spring. Yet something invisible had shifted. The palace no longer felt like a place protecting an old wound. It felt like a home slowly learning how to breathe again. Evelyn arrived at the eastern chamber carrying fresh tea and a small basket filled with white tulips gathered from the southern greenhouse. When she entered, she paused in surprise. The Queen Mother was already standing beside the open window, dressed in a pale blue gown instead of the darker colors she had worn every day for decades. Sunlight rested gently across her silver hair while birds gathered outside on the stone railing, filling the room with soft morning songs. She turned toward Evelyn with a peaceful smile that no longer seemed hesitant. "Good morning," she said quietly. Her voice remained delicate from years of silence, but every word sounded steadier than the day before. Evelyn returned the smile and greeted her just as warmly, resisting the temptation to celebrate every sentence. She understood that healing moved best when allowed to find its own pace. Together they arranged the fresh tulips inside a crystal vase before carrying breakfast into the small conservatory overlooking the gardens. Warm sunlight poured through the glass ceiling while flowering vines climbed gracefully around old stone columns. Sebastian soon joined them without ceremony, dressed simply in a charcoal suit instead of formal royal attire. For the first time since inheriting the throne, he sat beside his mother without an official meeting waiting afterward. They shared breakfast slowly, speaking only when something truly deserved to be said. The Queen Mother occasionally paused between sentences, not because she had forgotten how to speak, but because she had spent so many years believing silence was safer than conversation. No one hurried her. No one finished her thoughts, they simply listened. After breakfast, Sebastian asked the palace archivist to bring every surviving record connected to the Spring Melody Festival into the conservatory. Thick leather volumes soon covered one long oak table beneath the afternoon light. Evelyn quietly helped organize the fragile books while the Queen Mother carefully examined pages she had not opened in decades. Some photographs had faded. Several official reports still carried incorrect explanations written long ago to protect the family from unnecessary speculation. Sebastian looked toward his mother before speaking softly. "The truth does not dishonor father's memory," he said. "It honors your courage to finally carry it together instead of alone." The Queen Mother rested her hand upon one of the missing catalogue references before answering. "Then let the records be corrected," she replied, "not because history needs perfection, but because it deserves honesty." The archivist nodded respectfully and immediately began preparing revised historical notes that reflected what had truly happened. No blame, no curse, no mystery, only a family that had mistaken grief for guilt. Evelyn watched quietly from the far side of the table, realizing that history itself sometimes healed the same way people did. Not by pretending painful chapters never existed, but by finally placing them back where they belonged. As afternoon settled into evening, the Queen Mother asked to visit the palace chapel overlooking the western gardens. Candles flickered gently beneath stained glass windows, while soft golden light painted colorful reflections across the stone floor. She stood before a simple memorial dedicated to the former king and placed a single white tulip beside his portrait. There were no dramatic speeches, no impossible miracles. She simply smiled through grateful tears and whispered, "Thank you for choosing joy that day." Sebastian remained beside her in respectful silence. Evelyn waited several steps behind, allowing the family a private moment they had earned together. What Evelyn did not know was that members of the royal staff had quietly gathered outside the chapel doors, watching through the stained glass as the Queen Mother stood with calm strength instead of overwhelming sorrow. Many of them had served the palace for decades and had never imagined witnessing such peace. At that moment, the greatest change inside Blackthorn Manor was no longer that the Queen Mother had found her voice again. It was that every person who loved her had finally stopped asking her to live inside yesterday and had begun walking beside her toward tomorrow. Several weeks later, spring had fully arrived at Blackthorn Manor. The last traces of winter had disappeared from the gardens, replaced by rows of blooming roses, flowering dogwoods, and bright green lawns stretching toward the surrounding woods. Morning sunlight poured through every tall window, filling the palace with warmth that seemed to reach even the oldest stone walls. The eastern wing, once known only for its silence, had quietly become one of the brightest places inside the estate. Evelyn continued her daily routine with the same humility that had guided her from the beginning. She still prepared tea every morning. She still arranged fresh flowers by hand. She still sat beside the Queen Mother whenever invited, never speaking more than necessary, and never treating the extraordinary changes around her as though they belonged to her alone. She understood that healing belonged to the people who had chosen it. She had only been fortunate enough to witness it. The Queen Mother, however, no longer remained hidden inside her private chamber. Every afternoon she walked slowly through different parts of the manor, greeting staff members who had served the royal family faithfully for decades. Some conversations lasted only a few sentences because her voice was still growing stronger each day. Others consisted of nothing more than a warm smile and a simple question about someone's family or health. Those ordinary exchanges brought tears to more than one long-time employee. Many of them had forgotten what her voice sounded like. Others had never heard it at all. One bright Saturday, Sebastian announced a modest gathering in the palace courtyard to thank the household staff for their years of loyal service. There were no reporters, no political guests, and no elaborate ceremony. Long wooden tables were arranged beneath flowering trees while musicians from the local community played gentle acoustic melodies that echoed through the gardens. Fresh bread, fruit, homemade pies, and hot coffee replaced the formal banquets usually associated with royal events. It felt less like a state occasion and more like neighbors sharing a spring afternoon together. Evelyn helped the kitchen staff carry dishes into the courtyard, expecting nothing more than another busy day. She nearly dropped the basket she was carrying when Sebastian crossed the lawn and stopped beside her. Instead of speaking as a king addressing an employee, he spoke with quiet sincerity. "Would you join us at the family table today?" Evelyn hesitated immediately. "Your Majesty, I am one of the staff." Sebastian smiled gently before answering. "Today you are also family." Before Evelyn could respond, the Queen Mother stepped forward. Her movements were steady now, her smile peaceful. She reached for Evelyn's hand exactly as she had done on that unforgettable afternoon beside the eastern window, then gently led her toward the table, where 3 empty chairs waited beneath the shade of an old maple tree. No announcement was made, no explanation was necessary. Every servant watching understood the meaning of that simple gesture. Respect had quietly become belonging. Throughout the afternoon, stories replaced silence. The Queen Mother laughed softly while recalling Sebastian's childhood habit of sneaking into the kitchens, searching for fresh apple pie before dinner. Sebastian smiled with the embarrassed patience only a son could possess, while several cooks happily confirmed every detail of the story. Evelyn listened more than she spoke, occasionally sharing memories of growing up with her grandmother in Vermont and learning that kindness often sounded loudest when spoken quietly. The Queen Mother nodded knowingly. "Your grandmother taught you well," she said. "She also gave this family a gift without ever knowing it." Evelyn lowered her eyes, humbled by the words. She still believed she had done nothing remarkable. She had only remained beside someone the rest of the world believed could no longer be reached. As golden evening light settled across the gardens, musicians began playing the familiar melody from the old music box. This time the Queen Mother did not close her eyes in sorrow. She quietly hummed along, her voice still soft but filled with gentle confidence. Sebastian joined her after a few moments, remembering every note his father had once loved. Evelyn simply listened as the music floated through the warm spring air. What she did not know was that every member of the household would remember that quiet concert for the rest of their lives, not because it marked the return of a forgotten tradition, but because it proved that even the deepest silence could become music again, when enough patience, forgiveness, and kindness found their way home together. The days that followed seemed almost ordinary, and perhaps that was the greatest blessing of all. Inside Blackthorn Manor, ordinary moments had once been impossible to imagine. Now they arrived quietly, one after another, until they became the new heartbeat of the palace. The eastern chamber no longer stood closed behind heavy silence. Every morning its windows welcomed fresh air, sunlight, and the cheerful songs of robins nesting in the flowering trees outside. Fresh bouquets appeared without fail, not because tradition demanded them, because the Queen Mother now enjoyed choosing which flowers would brighten the room each day. Sometimes she preferred white lilies. Other mornings she selected pale blue hydrangeas or delicate wildflowers gathered from the woodland paths surrounding the estate. Evelyn happily accompanied her through the gardens, carrying a small woven basket while listening to gentle conversations that grew longer with each passing week. There was never any rush. Every sentence felt like a gift patiently unwrapped after many years of waiting. One afternoon, Sebastian invited only his mother and Evelyn to share a quiet luncheon inside the small sunroom overlooking the southern gardens. Unlike the formal dining hall with its towering ceilings and endless etiquette, this room felt warm and welcoming. Wooden shelves held family photographs beside well-loved novels. Fresh bread cooled upon a linen towel. Homemade soup filled the room with a comforting aroma of herbs and roasted vegetables. Sunlight filtered through climbing ivy, painting gentle patterns across the polished floor. It was the sort of room where memories naturally settled. The Queen Mother smiled as she carefully poured tea for everyone herself. The simple gesture caused Sebastian to pause for a brief moment before accepting the cup with both hands. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to receive something prepared by his mother instead of palace staff. Evelyn noticed the quiet exchange, but wisely allowed it to remain untouched by unnecessary words. Throughout lunch they spoke about ordinary things. The gardener's new rose bushes, a family of bluebirds nesting near the fountain, the bakery in town that still followed a recipe first introduced decades earlier by the former king. Laughter appeared naturally, never forced, never fragile. It sounded as though it had always belonged inside those walls. After the meal, the Queen Mother disappeared briefly before returning with the old watercolor album Evelyn had discovered weeks earlier. This time the missing pages had been carefully recreated by the royal archivist, using surviving sketches, photographs, and written descriptions preserved in separate collections. The restored volume no longer contained empty spaces. The Spring Melody Festival once again occupied its rightful place within the family's history. The Queen Mother gently placed the completed album into Evelyn's hands. "Please keep this with you for a while," she said softly. "Not because it belongs to you, but because you reminded us that memories should never disappear simply because they are painful." Evelyn accepted the book with visible emotion, running her fingertips across the newly restored pages. She understood that the album represented something much greater than history. It represented a family choosing truth over fear. As the afternoon faded into evening, Sebastian suggested one final walk through the gardens before sunset. The three of them followed the winding stone paths together, passing flowering trees now alive with butterflies and soft spring breezes. They eventually reached the old stone bench inside the conservatory where the Queen Mother had first invited Evelyn to sit beside her. Time seemed to pause there. The older woman smiled knowingly before taking the same seat she had occupied weeks earlier. She looked first at Sebastian, then at Evelyn. "This bench once reminded me of everything I had lost," she said quietly. "Now it reminds me of everyone who stayed." Neither Sebastian nor Evelyn tried to answer immediately. They simply sat beside her, watching the evening light settle gently across the gardens. What Evelyn did not know was that the household staff had quietly restored every neglected corner of the eastern gardens over the previous several weeks, inspired not by royal orders but by the hope they had witnessed growing inside the family they served. As hundreds of blooming flowers swayed gently beneath the fading sunlight, Blackthorn Manor no longer felt like a palace carrying the weight of yesterday. It had become a home where every new morning promised another ordinary conversation, another shared meal, another peaceful walk, and another chance to choose love over silence. Autumn returned to Blackthorn Manor almost exactly 1 year after Evelyn Foster had first walked through the eastern corridor carrying a simple silver tray and far more kindness than she realized. The gardens outside the palace windows had transformed once again, their leaves glowing in shades of gold, amber and crimson, before drifting gently across the familiar stone paths. Inside the manor, however, one tradition had quietly changed forever. Every morning, just after sunrise, 3 cups of tea were placed beside the eastern window instead of one. The room that had once been known for its silence had become the warmest corner of the estate. Evelyn entered carrying a fresh bouquet of white lilies mixed with autumn branches covered in bright red berries. The Queen Mother looked up from the book resting in her lap and greeted her with an easy smile that now came as naturally as breathing. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said. Her voice had grown stronger over the months, steady enough to fill the room without effort, yet it never lost the gentle warmth that had returned on the day she first whispered those unforgettable words. Sebastian arrived a few moments later, carrying a small wooden box polished to a soft shine. He placed it carefully upon the table beside the window before opening the lid. Inside rested the restored silver pocket watch, the tiny music box, and the completed watercolor album that now contained every page of the family's history exactly as it had truly happened. Nothing had been hidden, nothing had been erased. The Queen Mother gently touched each keepsake before looking toward her son. "Your father always believed memories became lighter when they were shared," she said softly. "It only took me far too long to understand what he meant." Sebastian smiled with quiet affection. "You understand now," he answered. "That is all that matters." The 3 of them carried their tea onto the enclosed veranda overlooking the gardens. Beyond the glass, children from the nearby town laughed while helping palace gardeners plant spring bulbs that would bloom months later. The manor had opened its grounds to local families every weekend, a tradition Sebastian introduced after realizing that a home filled only with guarded silence could never truly honor the people his parents had loved. Evelyn watched the children chasing colorful leaves across the lawn and thought about how different everything looked from the frightened young woman who had first crossed the eastern hallway believing she was delivering nothing more than a tray of tea. She had never searched for recognition. She had never expected to become part of anyone's story. Yet kindness had quietly written a place for her where ambition never could. The Queen Mother closed the watercolor album before handing it to Evelyn once more. "One day," she said with peaceful certainty, "someone else will open these pages and wonder how our family found its way back to one another. I hope they notice that no grand miracle appears anywhere inside this book. Only patience, only forgiveness. Only one person willing to stay when leaving would have been easier." Evelyn held the album close, humbled by words she never believed she deserved. Sebastian looked from his mother to Evelyn before speaking with the calm confidence that had slowly replaced years of quiet sorrow. "A kingdom remembers its kings," he said. "A family remembers the person who taught them how to become one again." Outside, light breeze carried dozens of golden leaves past the veranda windows. They drifted across the gardens before settling beneath the same old trees that had watched every season of the family's joy, grief, silence, and healing. As evening slowly approached, the first delicate snowflakes of the new winter began falling among the autumn leaves, just enough to dust the garden paths without covering them completely. The Queen Mother smiled as she watched the unlikely meeting of 2 seasons. Then she began telling a story from Sebastian's childhood, her gentle laughter filling the room while her son and Evelyn listened beside her. Beyond the window, snow continued to fall exactly as it had on the day Evelyn first entered the chamber. But this time the quiet room was no longer defined by silence. It was filled with conversation, warmth, shared memories, and the peaceful certainty that the deepest wounds do not always heal because someone finds the perfect words. Sometimes they heal because someone chooses to remain beside another heart until the words are finally ready to return.